In the world of anime and manga, there are few, if any, people with the power to captivate an audience to the extent of that achieved by Naoki Urasawa. You don't know him? Well, I'm sure you've heard of at least one or two of his works, specifically Monster being by far his most popular and successful work, with both the manga and the anime being one of the best in the business. And like many people, the incredible Monster anime was my introduction into Naoki Urasawa, so naturally I started to take a look down the rabbit hole, and what I found was one of the best pieces of fiction I've ever read. None other than 20th Century Boys, and here is why you should read it. Let's start by talking about the synopsis. 20th Century Boys begins with our protagonist, Kenji Endo, in the year 1997. Here he lives a somewhat uneventful life, working in his family-run convenience store accompanied by his mother and his baby niece, Kana. However, after some time, he starts to notice the use of a specific symbol used in unusual circumstances, and as it turns out, this symbol was created by Kenji and their group during their childhood days in 1969, an incredibly important time period that we'll get onto shortly. And one thing to note straight away is how this manga deals with time. The story constantly switches back and forth between the late 60s to early 70s, late 90s to the dawn of the 21st century, and eventually from the 2010s onwards. But anyway, in 1997, Kenji discovers this symbol is being used by an underground religious sect led by this manga's antagonist, simply known as Friend. And oh boy, what an antagonist he is, culminating in a large-scale conspiracy created by their childish fantasies. The main way to summarise the synopsis is this. Imagine the most cliché, generic, done-to-death plot you could imagine. A group of good guys fighting back against an evil supervillain with goals of world domination. I mean, come on, that would never seem believable. Or would it? Because as it turns out, 20th Century Boys is exactly that. On the surface, an incredibly simple synopsis of good versus bad, but in reality, it is much, much more complex, taking this childish, ridiculous idea into a disturbingly believable reality. In their childhoods, Kenji and his group would often fantasize about the future, specifically the mystery of the 21st century and what it would entail. As such, Kenji notes down points about what the future may look like and how them, the protectors of justice, would take down all evil. However, it soon becomes evident that these clearly juvenile, obviously ridiculous ideas stop being a childish fiction and instead creep their way into reality, at the hands of the aforementioned Friend, leading to some of the more dystopian sci-fi parts of this manga. So from that point onwards, much like in Monster, this manga is heavily reliant on mystery. Who is Friend, and how were Kenji's childhood ideas implanted in his head? There's a common saying that 20th Century Boys is just Monster, but on a larger scale, in terms of plot, characters, and the ultimate mystery aspect of both stories, which is a great way of putting it, but there's a lot more to it than just Monster but more. Sure, they do both parallel each other quite a lot, there's a lot of common themes between the two, such as how childhood experiences can dramatically shape an individual, and in general a strong emphasis on psychology as a whole, but just because they're parallel, it doesn't mean they're going in the same direction. Whereas Monster is relatively confined, focusing more on interactions between individuals, 20th Century Boys focuses more on society as a whole. How the smallest of actions can lead to the most dramatic of consequences, a terrifying idea that is exploited to its fullest extent in the manga. Suspense is the name of the game when it comes to 20th Century Boys. It is one of the most engaging works of fiction I've consumed. The kind of manga where you think to yourself, just one more chapter won't hurt. So you keep going, and going, and going, and going, and before you know it, you've been reading for about 7 hours. Naoki Urasawa is a master of knowing how to suck you in. The ultimate mystery of who is Friend and what does he stand for dominates the vast majority of the plot and acts as the main driving force for the entire narrative. Much like other great villains from anime and manga, like Makishima from Psycho Pass, Valentine from JoJo, and of course Johan from Monster, despite not having to be there physically, Friend's presence is always there, pulling the strings behind the scenes, giving the atmosphere an ominous quality like no other. The juxtaposition between regular people living their regular lives and this totalitarian regime out for world domination is disturbing, to put it lightly. Now, I gotta be honest, I'm a bit of a sucker for dystopian sci-fi. the what-if scenarios for society to advance towards, with some of my favourite depictions of dystopia in anime, including the aforementioned Psycho Pass, Akira, Evangelion, and The Promised Neverland. For me personally, I find it fascinating seeing how the future can be depicted, acting as a bit of a time capsule of the thoughts and fears plaguing people at the time. But nothing I've seen has invested me as much in a world as the dystopian society depicted in 20th Century Boys. A world of propaganda, censorship, and lies. While the people of Japan live their day-to-day lives, the Friendship Party reigns supreme, casting a blood-stained shadow over the nation, with most being none the wiser. The scariest part of it all is the contrast between the atrocities committed by Friend and society's tendency to conform. Friend commands the absolute loyalty of the public, all the way from his beginnings as a small-scale cult leader to his aspirations to become world president. As mentioned earlier, more so than most, this world is eerily believable, as are most of the important reasons as to why this plot is so engaging. Now of course, I can't get into the specifics, since this video is aimed to encourage people who haven't seen this masterpiece yet, but I will get into some key points and keep spoilers to a minimum. As mentioned, the manga is split into 3 distinct time periods, past, present and future, with the vast majority of the plot occurring in the future, in a world where Japan is under the complete control of Friend. The first 150 chapters especially are fantastic. We're introduced to our rich and diverse cast, most of the key plot points dominating the story, and most importantly, our protagonist, or protagonists I should say, Kenji and Kana, who we'll dive into a bit later. The 2 main factors that kept me so engaged were believability and mystery, the latter of which is incredibly significant right from the beginning. Nothing is straightforward in this manga, and that's a good thing. Whenever you think the plot can only go in one direction, it does a complete 180, of which the vast majority of these plot twists and revelations don't feel forced or superficial, whereas a lot of anime and manga based on mystery can still be somewhat predictable. 20th Century Boys, and in fact all of Urasawa's manga, constantly remains open-ended, like you're staring into an empty canvas. There are a few hints here and there, and as a whole I think you can get a lot out of this manga by reading it for a second time with the benefit of hindsight, since the mystery aspect of this manga is handled perfectly. The core plot and writing as a whole is also incredibly layered and complex, taking on a loosely arc-based structure, not in the sense of how in shonen you have defined arcs for the X number of episodes, but you do get a certain feeling of beginning, middle and end within certain parts of the manga. And this works pretty well in its favour. By splitting it up into smaller chunks, it stops the core narrative from dragging on too much. Something climactic happens, and immediately after we're introduced to new characters and plot points, making it feel somewhat fresh. At times it does get a bit convoluted. Naoki Urasawa certainly has a bad habit of introducing more concepts and plot points than he knows how to resolve, but too much is certainly better than too little, and serves to make the large-scale interconnected world feel even more believable. Also, don't get me wrong, given how long the manga is, there definitely are some parts that drag on for way too long, especially near the end. At times it does feel like a fetch quest in a video game. One character talks to another, who guides them to the next person, and then the next, and then the next person, and so on and so forth. But as a whole, the pacing is handled pretty well. One of the main criticisms of Monster is that it feels pretty slow at times, whereas here it feels a lot more fluid. In Monster, a lot of major plot points are completely isolated, whereas in 20th Century Boys, they're almost always connected to something down the road. The interconnection of the plot in 20th Century Boys cannot be stressed enough. Not one scene or character feels wasted. They all provide some level of significance to advance the plot in some way. It's common in anime and manga, particularly in shonen, for some characters to just kind of exist, with said existence being completely superfluous. But here, pretty much all of the main cast have distinct purposes, not just for advancing the plot, they all have 3-dimensional motivations and personalities, again helping the manga feel, our favourite word, believable. It's also worth noting just how much this manga teases you. Going back to my point of the plot not being linear in the slightest, I don't think there's a single major revelation that is actually shown first time round. Just as something major is about to be unveiled, without fail, the next page cuts to a completely different scene, only to learn the aftermath at a later time. Obviously, this is the oldest trick in the book when it comes to suspense you will undoubtedly be forced into reading on, but as masterful as it is, my god, it does not get any less painful. 20th Century Boys is also heavily based upon historical and cultural context, which I find quite interesting. Whereas most manga and anime take place in their own world, disattached from our society, Urasawa's works are much more grounded in reality, with this being no exception. It's immediately obvious the strong emphasis on music, specifically 70s rock that dominated the lives of Kenji and his friends during their childhoods, with this motif being carried all the way to the end of the manga, with of course the most explicit example being the title itself. Kenji's song in particular, Bob Lennon, is an incredibly powerful symbol used repeatedly in the manga, and even as someone who doesn't know the first thing about music, it struck a chord with me by the end, even though, of course, you can't actually hear it. And as a side note on the topic, I find it amazing that because Urasawa is a talented musician himself, he's actually performed the song at concerts and included the chords to the song in the manga itself, which I find pretty incredible. Seeing a mangaka go out of their way to effectively write their own soundtrack, that is dedication. But anyway now, there's also a ton of interesting historical context. As said before, the dystopian future of 20th Century Boys has its origins in Kenji's childhood fantasies from the late 60s to the early 70s, and you can see how this was shaped by the time. Firstly, the rapid advancement of scientific possibility following the 1969 moon landing has a long-standing impact, leading to some of the ridiculous ideas conjured up by Kenji and co, now that this Pandora's box of scientific enlightenment has been opened. The future dystopian setting and constant questioning of morality over what is good and what is bad was also probably shaped by the Cold War. What is it that determines our views on good or bad? Is it propaganda or our own free will? The emphasis on indoctrination of the public into Friend's regime is undoubtedly allegorical of censorship and propaganda, warping the perceptions of who is the enemy on both sides of the Cold War. Having lived in those years himself, I'm sure Urasawa did this intentionally as a sort of what-if worst-case scenario. And then finally, one of the key points that underpins the plot of 20th Century Boys is the 1970 Osaka World Expo, a world fair attended by most of the world's great powers, with the famous motto, progress and harmony for mankind. This is a recurring image which is a pivotal element of the plot, a symbol of hope and unity across the world, manifesting the initial thoughts of justice made up by Kenji and his group. But with that being said, let's talk about the ending, why don't we? Again, no major spoilers, although skip to the time you see on screen if you want to go in completely blind. But again, much like Monster, Urasawa is pretty infamous for his endings. And by the ending, I mean the last 70 chapters or so, where it does admittedly start to go a little downhill. The momentum certainly does start to cool off slightly. Does it ruin the entire manga? No, absolutely not. But it is worth mentioning as a showcase that this manga is not perfect, albeit pretty close. To be blunt, the ending was unsatisfying, mostly due to the point I made earlier of how Urasawa tends to needlessly overcomplicate his works by adding more and more concepts which pile onto each other until it gets a little ridiculous. All in all, there's not a whole lot I can comment on. If I were to represent the quality of writing on a line graph, it would look a little something like this. Less of a testament to the ending being especially bad, and more of a testament to the early parts of the manga being especially good. But moving on now, and we've talked about the overall plot, but what about the characters themselves? You can't have a good plot with bad characters, and this is no exception. The cast of 20th Century Boys is amazing, especially our protagonists, Kenji and Kana. What I love so much about not just these two, but the cast as a whole, as we'll get onto later, is that they are completely normal people. Kenji in particular is the epitome of this. He feels like an actual human being, and not just some larger-than-life manga protagonist. With anime and manga being a medium in which teenagers with magic powers and swords bigger than themselves are commonplace, it's a nice change to have people who are actually just regular members of society. We have Kenji, a convenience store manager in his mid-30s, you have Yoshitsune, an office job worker, Yukaji, an airport guard, Maruo, a shop owner, Karyon, a sober chef. The point is they all feel realistic. They all have normal jobs, normal personalities, and ultimately feel like regular people you'd see when walking down the street. Kenji in particular is an incredibly believable character. He acts on his own moral intuition, and going back to the whole point of the plot being a generic premise of good versus bad on the surface, but much more complex underneath, Kenji is the embodiment of this. As per his childhood ambitions, he fights for justice, accepting his responsibility for creating the ideas in Friend's mind and taking steps to undo them. Simply put, he's just an all-round good guy, but unlike some protagonists with the whole power of friendship nonsense, Kenji's actions are much more grounded and realistic. He has a clear moral compass as to what he believes to be good or bad, and is prepared to do what he thinks is right. While some protagonists are just morally good for the sake of them filling the role of the protagonist, Kenji feels much more legitimate. Not like his character's been moulded into being the traditional protagonist archetype, but instead that his thoughts and emotions are his own. Nothing more than a regular guy trying to adapt to an irregular situation. For instance, he's constantly scared. He's not a noble warrior charging off into battle, he considers the risks, he contemplates giving up, and he isn't prepared to endanger those around him. Ultimately, he's not romanticised as some grandiose arbiter of justice, he is incredibly human, and as such, incredibly believable. And for the most part, the same could be said of our second protagonist, Kana, who I believe is a little more controversial. Having grown up during Friend's regime, she is a remnant of the past, one of the few people yet to be indoctrinated into Friend's modern society. As a teenager, she's much less mature than Kenji, acting primarily on impulses with no clear direction. She's overly ambitious, overly emotional, and overly optimistic, but not so far to the point where she feels unrealistic. Her motives are pretty simple, and she makes rash decisions, acting on her own accord, which you could argue makes her a little bit annoying at times, but I think it makes her even more realistic. The whole world is completely against her. Of course she's gonna act like this. For me, she feels like a bit of a paradox, smart but naive at the same time. Maybe a bit shonen-y in the sense that no matter what the situation, she always seems to come out on top, but definitely a good protagonist, don't get me wrong. As mentioned, Kenji's gang are similar to him in the sense that they're just regular people forced into a world they don't want to be a part of, and there are a lot of them, like really, a lot. This manga has one of the biggest casts of any piece of media I've consumed. Whereas in, again, Monster, there is a large cast no doubt, but most of them are periodic side characters that only show up for a single arc perhaps. You only have about 4 or 5 major characters that you constantly have to consider at any given time. It's much more confined. But meanwhile, in 20th Century Boys, it can get a little bit overwhelming at times, the sheer amount of people in some way impacting the plot. Whereas with Monster, it's only about 4 or 5 significant characters. Here, it's upwards of 20. There is a lot to take in. Less of a criticism and more of just a heads up, I suppose. But now, let's get on to the man himself, our antagonist, Friend. Essentially a child trapped inside a man's body. While most people forget about their absurd childhood ambitions, Friend makes it a point to pursue his ridiculous goal of world domination. And that's what's so ominous, a clearly ridiculous cartoonish motive that is made unsettlingly believable. His warped views on what is good and what is bad dominate the world, essentially making the world population his puppets. As mentioned earlier, whether physically there or not, his presence as the antagonist is powerful. He dominates each panel he appears in as the centre of attention, with the best instance of this being the cover of Volume 20. Such simple yet effective imagery. If there's one thing I can say for certain, Naoki Urasawa is a god of crafting an antagonist, and Friend is a prime example. Along with Johan, he is one of the best villains in anime and manga, and as a whole, the characters of 20th Century Boys are fantastic. For the most part, the only major problem that I have, in fact it's probably my biggest gripe with the manga as a whole, is certain characters having access to seemingly supernatural powers, specifically Kana and a character known as Kami or God. At certain parts, especially near the end, Kana is seen to have a psychic power where she can seemingly communicate with others. Sure, it is given a legitimate reason later on, but it does feel like a bit of a cheap plot device. And in the case of God, he can just straight up see the future without any reason given, which is definitely a cheap plot device. Ultimately, this isn't a huge focus and only comes up occasionally, but even still, it does feel out of place for such a logical manga so grounded in reality. But as a whole, I'm purely just nitpicking. The characters are all fantastic. But now, I think it's time to move on to something equally fantastic, and that would be the art. So it's no secret that Naoki Urasawa has an incredibly distinct art style, which has grown on me more and more over time. I think it looks great and feeds in with the more realistic nature of Urasawa's manga, having characters with somewhat reasonable facial and body proportions. Urasawa's especially good at capturing facial expressions. All of his characters are incredibly emotive, avoiding a lot of the classic anime and manga tropes when it comes to depicting emotion, like for example those vertical blue lines for sadness and that classic red mark for anger. Instead, as with the rest of the manga, the faces feel much more realistic. Sure, a lot of characters do end up looking slightly similar, occasionally having to be identified by their hair more than anything else, but ultimately, it's not a huge deal, it still looks amazing. His sketch-like art style is just charming to me. I love it when manga artists have distinguished art styles instead of just sticking with the norm. It helps make his work feel that much more recognisable and gives it even more of an identity. To put it lightly, it is refreshing seeing characters that deviate away from the highly stylised and exaggerated designs of mainstream anime and manga, which have their place, do not get me wrong. Stuff like Demon Slayer and JoJo have some of my favourite art styles and character designs in the medium, but the pure simplicity of Urasawa's character design is what I like. In reality, nobody has bright pink hair and eyes as big as their entire heads because it's unrealistic, which is why anime and manga work so well. But seeing a mangaka that actually does capture realism to a certain extent is certainly a nice change of pace. I also want to talk about how good his art is at capturing the mood. This manga is dark and ominous, which comes across in his art. There's always a sort of gloomy atmosphere lingering over each scene. Since the vast majority of major scenes occur either at night or in an abandoned building, you always have these large shadows enveloping their surroundings, only further contributing to the mysterious atmosphere built up so far. Even in the middle of the day, it still constantly feels both literally and figuratively dark. Maybe I am reaching a bit, but his use of light and shadow is incredibly effective and serves to capture the mood of the scene that much more. The sheer level of detail as well is also pretty incredible, which should go without saying, especially in some of the double-page panels, showcasing larger structures such as buildings towering above the Tokyo skyline. It just looks good. I'm sure you can see that for yourself, so there's not too much more to comment on. Some of his setting design as well really does bring out the uncanny feel of the dystopian world. The manga is filled with no jump scares, but certainly unsettling imagery that builds up over time, usually due to the contrast between the seemingly innocent setting and the darker undertones accompanying it. The best example would be the setting of Tabidachi land, which is unveiled at about a quarter of the way in, and serves as the basis for one of the key plot points. Basically, it's an amusement park focused entirely on brainwashing the younger generation into Friend's new world. Basically, state propaganda at its highest extent. And it is terrifying. But with that being said, Naoki Urasawa is a genius when it comes to art, as it is with his writing. I don't think anyone's doubting that, so in that case, let's move on to a bit of a conclusion. Okay, so if you've made it this far, I know I can keep it quick because my thoughts on 20th Century Boys are pretty clear. I wouldn't be making a video on it if I didn't absolutely love it, and of course, I would highly recommend reading it. If I were to compare it to other anime and manga, the best way I could put it is monster crossed with psychopaths, but also not entirely. It's hard to say. I mean, the fact that I'm struggling to compare it with other works just goes to show how unique it is. Sure, it is long, 249 chapters and an additional 16 chapters as part of 21st Century Boys, which by the way isn't a sequel, just a different name for the last 2 volumes, but ultimately, length is rewarded with satisfaction. The mystery aspect is incredibly engaging and keeps you captivated from start to finish. Even in some parts that suffer from bad pacing issues, you're still gonna continue no matter what. Dropping this manga midway through is practically suicide. The world is complex and eerily believable. It's not too hard to imagine a master propagandist rising to power and employing some of the same measures we see Friend do on a smaller scale. It is a terrifying reminder of how easily we can be influenced by figures of high status. Dystopia is a fascinating thing, and I think the best analogy for the world of 20th Century Boys would be the infamous Milgram's experiment, which tested exactly what we see in the manga. Our tendencies to conform to those with power against our own moral judgment. All in all, the characters are fantastic, the art is fantastic, the plot is developed, complex, and of course, fantastic, and as a whole, 20th Century Boys is at the moment my personal favourite manga. Will it ever get an anime? Probably not, but it's good to have dreams. And with that being said, I'll be back in the next one. See ya!